By the way, if you haven't watched their TikToks, oh my god, some of them are fucking hilarious. So, um, for something that's like trying to be smart and educational and also have some like explanatory power, like it's pretty good.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, like, I don't know. This week's kind of been another shit show. So, what's your reaction? What's your thoughts? What's going on?
Yeah, I don't know. It's honestly probably the most popular TikTok we made this week was about juristocracy, which is this concept of basically the ruling class is going to use the courts to push more and more autocratic and more undemocratic policies, especially as people, as discontent continues to rise and the masses are increasingly discontented with our political system that only serves one class. That political system increasingly uses the courts to crack down on people, and we've seen a lot of examples of that. And yeah, there's a book, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's called Juristocracy, and it basically expands on that concept. Talks about Citizens United, and now there's the repeal of Roe v. Wade, which obviously a majority of people don't support in this country. So yeah, I think that's an increasing trend that we're seeing, but ultimately it's just a trend of, the capitalist class, the bourgeois class trying to keep their stranglehold on our state apparatus. Yeah.
I think the book you're referring to is Towards Juristocracy by Rand Herschel. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah. That'd be the
Okay,
one, yeah.
Marcus.
Well, I mean, I'm looking it up like that. That was not from memory. I will admit I did not know that was a book until just now.
So, FYI, by the way, both Eddie and Carlos have recommended books. I like as often as I recommend books, they recommend me stuff that I'm fascinated by. So I just bought Hammer and Hoe, which I heard they recommended like a couple weeks ago on their stream. Pretty good book about, like, again, this kind of Midwestern tradition of Marxism that a lot of people forgot.
That's awesome.
So what differentiates the Midwestern Marxist approach from that of, like, I suppose, contemporary Marxist thought, or more traditionalist, like European Marxism?
Yeah, I'll let maybe Carlos talk more about the difference between our approach to, like, European Marxism, I guess, but we're based in Marxist-Leninist principles. But one thing that we stress is, like, the U.S. is such a large area geographically. You have different cultures based on what part of the U.S. you're in. The South is going to be different than the Eastern United States. It's going to be different than the Midwest. Is going to be different than the West. So, each sort of area has a sort of unique proletariat and a unique culture among their proletariat, which is going to require unique organizing skills. So I don't think, what's necessarily going to organize the proletariat in California might not be the same thing that's going to organize workers here in the Midwest. Might take a different approach, talking about different issues. So that's one of our focuses, but we definitely have, pretty traditional Marxist-Leninist principles, but I don't even want to say traditional because Marxism-Leninism has been expanding and building on itself and criticizing itself, since its inception. But yeah, I'll let Carlos could probably explain that better than me.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us on. I couldn't say that earlier because of the technological backwardness. I have, so what sets us apart is that we, from the start, we tried to sort of cross this bridge that we saw existing between, like, activists and labor organizing and the working class in the U.S. and, like, left academia and Marxism that comes from the academia. We saw a divide, and although we wanted to maintain, like, a theoretical rigor in our analysis, we also wanted to be grounded in what we think is essential to Marxism, which is trying to change the world. I think a lot of the times what ends up happening with Marxism in the academy is that it's done for the sake of journal publications, it's done for the sake of books, and I think that strips the revolutionary essence out of Marxism. I think Marxism is its best theoretical insights come about when it's actively engaging in revolutionary praxis. So that's one of the first things that set us into creating this project. We saw that there was that split, and to this day, right now in our organization, we have 40-something writers, and most of them are active on the ground in different parties and different organizations like DSA, CPUSA, PCUSA, PSL, and they do work in the theoretical sense. They publish articles, make videos, but they're also on the ground, organizing their coworkers, organizing rallies and protests and these sorts of things. And then theoretically, have an openness with our publishing policy where we allow a space for more general leftist discourse insofar as it doesn't promote imperialism, bigotry, a certain form of, we can't do anything, pessimism. We allow a broad arena, of course, but in terms of like the editors, most of us have a traditional Marxist-Leninist line. As many people think, something that distinguishes us in praxis. When you talk about Marxism-Leninism, the first thing that comes to a lot of people's minds is just the vanguard. But the way that I approach Marxism-Leninism as a philosopher is also a way of relating to certain sets of philosophical problems, right? So I know Professor Q mentioned that there was a hard scientist in this room.
Well, yeah, actually, me and Grimlow are the only kind of soft science folks. So everyone else is a hard science, which is what makes this so freaking amazing to me. In some ways.
So, for instance, in the question of the relationship of Marxism to science, there's a very specific line that Marxism-Leninism takes that, like Western Marxist traditions, the Frankfurt School, the traditions of critical theory that come from France, the traditions of Marxism humanism, that they reject. They don't want necessarily a connection with the sciences. They say the sciences are just positivism, and they reject the sciences. Whereas Marxism-Leninism says, no, there's a role that dialectical materialism can different sciences and looking at them in their interconnection, in their movement. And so, for instance, this is a theoretical question where, my classification of myself as a Marxist-Leninist is not just something that points me to a form of political practice, which, as Eddie mentioned, is adjusted with context and with different concrete analysis of different concrete situations. But it's also a way that I approach certain theoretical questions like, what's the relationship of Marxism to science? What's the relationship of Engels to Marx? These sorts of things. So this line hasn't really been quite popular in Marxist thinking in the US for quite a long time. So at times, we always have people tell us that what we're saying is new, but none of the stuff we're really saying is new. We're just, building on Marxist-Leninist thinkers of the past that are unfortunately not very well known here in the US.
So I want to touch on that just a little bit and probe that. Can you kind of expand on that? Because I know why it's an issue in sociology, but you're in philosophy and political science. So why do you think that is?
The lack of Marxist-Leninist ideas?
Yeah. Because I'll be honest, in my grad program, we got just a sliver of it. And so a lot of times when I'm watching your guys' streams, I'm like, wow, this is something I don't know about. So I need to, actually, you guys make me want to read more. So.
Well, I think it's for political reasons, right? So when people raise the banners of socialism across the Eastern and global South, what they think about when they think of Marxism, they think of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. That's what comes to mind. When we think of Marxism in the West, I was playing around the other day. We did a stream interview with Professor Gabriel Rocco, and I said, look, we got to make a meme. And someone ended up making it on Twitter, but the meme was like, Mom, can I get Marxism? We have Marxism at home, and then you don't know in what people think of Marxism in the West, right? When I went into my grad program 3 years ago now, I said I was a Marxist, and they said, "Oh, cool, we have a critical theorist on board who does this." And it's like, I'm not against it. I've read, enjoy it, but for me, coming from this Marxist-Leninist tradition, that is a tradition that was specifically set out to oppose communism. It's what we call left anti-communism. And what we saw with Professor Gabriel Roth's interview, he's just published a piece in the Philosophical Salon on the connections of the Frankfurt School, more specifically focused on Adorno Horkheimer, to the CIA. And so he's constructing what he's calling a political economy of ideas, and seeing why it is that, as Professor Q mentioned, and as I experienced, when you want to learn about Marxism in the West, there's the Marxist tradition is just never, it's not accessible. And that's very direct, right? They want a Marxism that is able to reject any attempt that was done in the past at socialism. A Marxism that says, look, capitalism sucks, socialism, maybe that's okay, but every time it's been tried in the East, in the global South, it's always failed. It's always failed. And, doing so is intentional. It limits our ability to oppose imperialism, right? Which is central. We're living in the belly of the beast, as Marti, called it, which is a phrase that is now circling around quite a bit. But we're living in the belly of the beast, and I think the primary contradiction that we have to attack is imperialism. And you can attack it if the people fighting imperialism in your mind are as bad as the capitalists. Like, Marcuse does in One-Dimensional Man, where he just treats as the same, just because they're both totalitarian, and because they're both participating in creating industrial societies, they're both the same, right? And that's a general trend that you get from the Marxism that's acceptable, the compatible left that you find here in the West. And our tradition is completely different to that. And because of political reasons, we can't allow that tradition to be disseminated in academia. No one in academia reads Michael Parenti, right? I've talked to, Marxist philosophers that have spent their whole life publishing on rare manuscripts that Marx wrote. They don't know who Michael Parenti is. They don't know some of the central figures that have developed Marxist thought in action in trying to construct socialist projects. And that's why it kind of seems like the stuff we do is new, but it's not new.
Yeah, and I want to answer your question a little bit too, because I come at it from a little bit of a different perspective than Carlos. He's philosophy and I'm political science, but it overlaps a lot. But what I learned in 4 years of political science, I was like, oh my God, like the U.S. is evil. They're literally evil. And every time a socialist experiment's been created, all the forces of imperialism descend on this place and do everything they can to destroy it. And then the media blasts, over a loudspeaker like, oh, socialism has failed. Look at this place where the U.S. carpet bombed their country. Look what socialism did here. And basically though, I thought it reminds me of something Che Guevara said about the U.S., where growing up he basically thought the U.S. was run by like evil wizards and dark princes. And that's kind of what I thought. I'm just like, we just have to continually vote for the right people to get the evil people out. But then I read Lenin's Imperialism, right? Then Carlos started getting me into Marxism. I'm like, why does this book from 1917 explain U.S. imperialism better than anything I've learned in 4 years of political science? But Lenin's imperialism has been systematically ripped from academia because they don't want you, to read something like that. Because in just a short pamphlet or a short book, that's 7 to 8 chapters, it can explain the whole of imperialism. There's banks and oligarchs who have monopolized and they're expanding into markets to try and export capital and control labor and resources overseas and abroad. And when socialist experiments pop up, those same oligarchs, do everything they can to destabilize these experiments. So, it's just, I think it has an explanatory power in political science and foreign policy that is missing from the field more generally.
If I can add also something real quick, because it's related to the topic, scholarly, if the main enemy that this Western Marxism has is Marxism-Leninism, just by reading the tradition of the Western Marxists, we should be able to say something about Marxist-Leninist thinkers, right? Because the way that you provide critique is by engaging with the sources that you're critiquing. But we can't say anything about Marxist-Leninist thinkers, because when you read a book like Soviet Marxism, which was quite literally funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations in Harvard that were explicitly anti-communist, when you read a book like Marcuse's Soviet Marxism or these other books that are critiquing the Marxism of the Soviet Union, look at their citations. Are they citing Soviet scholars? No, they're not. At best, maybe they're citing these manuals that were done to disseminate to people who had just learned how to read what Marxism is. Or maybe they're citing a 36-page document, which is Stalin's Dialectical and Historical Materialism. So what happened to scholarly rigor? What happened to scholarly rigor? Engage with the fucking sources. If you're going to critique... I'm sorry, can I curse?
No, go
Swear
ahead,
away.
man. Go on.
Go off,
Engage
King.
with the sources. Engage with the sources if you're going to critique it. Because we do. When we critique the Western Marxist tradition, we engage with the sources because we've had that shoved on our mouth the whole time. So we engage with the sources, but they don't. And they can't, right? They can't, because if you trace it to the political economy of ideas, as Gabriel Rockhill has done, those ideas are directly funded by the interests their philosophy supposedly says they want to overcome. They want to overcome capitalism, yet they're funded by the biggest capitalist imperialist powers, foundations, and the state institutions that have done the coups all over the world.
I'm getting real intense flashbacks of like climate science talking. Like people that are climate scientists usually say the same thing. Like they know the opposing side never engages with the material, and we've had that discussion on this panel quite a few times where they're just shoveling out shit and you can't keep up with it because you're doing it in a more vigorous way than they would ever dare to. So
Yeah, I think like that builds into a greater question that I think both Carlos and Eddie have hinted at. And Amber, I think you're also correct in saying we probably alluded to this or maybe covered it in more of a surface level before, but someone in chat also correctly pointed this out, and it dovetails really well into this point. Richard Wolff has mentioned a lot of the time, as it pertains to like undergraduate level education as a specific example, socialist thought is not really taught. Like it's just something that seems to be not really present within academia, especially as it pertains to higher ed. It runs contrary to what conservative talking points are in college being a giant communist radicalization camp for your children. But we know better. We know, like, as being part of that institution of higher ed, we know that a lot of the reactionary forces that you mentioned still are very present and run the institution in many ways. So all of that, I guess, to build up to the question of how do we actually, one, either within academia or in ways that are functionally equivalent to academia, how do we like loop other people into Marxist thought without just like regurgitating half a library of theory? And two, for lay people, like that's something that we do a lot, is talk about the hard science, quote unquote, with people who aren't necessarily in higher ed or doing that as an occupation, to try and make people more well-rounded. So how do we go about that from sort of like a political education sense? Like how do we loop in the quote unquote normies of the world to start thinking the way we do?
Yeah, I guess maybe Carlos can talk about reaching people in academia, but one thing I didn't ever want to do the TikToks necessarily as our main form of content, but they've blown up, and as they've blown up, I've come to appreciate them more. The fact that people are on this app, maybe they only have a few hours, in the day to relax in between work or whatever. So, they need this information shoved into a bite-sized form. So I think finding new ways to like repackage this information, especially with the technological revolution, and reach people. I mean, that's been one of the main things that we've been focusing on. Because one thing too, going back to the Marxist-Leninist tradition, like it's a common thing to simplify Marxist theory so that we can disseminate it to the masses, because the most important thing for a Marxist-Leninist is actually changing the world, not just doing critical theory locked in a room somewhere. So we want to find new ways to still give good information, correct information, but do it in a way that's, you know, compact, not just, like you said, giving people tons of theory to read, but explaining it to them in a way they can understand. And that's one of the main things I guess I've tried to do with our TikTok and YouTube and stuff. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like that's converging on propaganda, like literal, almost like leftist agitprop.
Well,
Yep.
we
Yeah,
have
it
like
is
the worst
propaganda.
agitprop on the left. Like we don't do it nearly enough.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, I'm
Mao
curious.
used to call it brainwashing.
Yeah, I'm curious. Like, what do you guys think are the big, like, main points that you could distill down that you think that like Marx got really right, and then what do you think that he got like wrong in kind of like the guise of like how's Marxism changed like since like Marx himself?
Yeah. Do you want to go
me
for that one,
tackle
Carlos?
that one? Yeah. So to go back to the other one, because you had also mentioned the academia thing, like I included in my intro to philosophy classes. I've been teaching for 2 years my own intro to philosophy class, and I get to just add whatever I want. I add my Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Che in there, and surprisingly, what I have found is that those are the readings that people enjoy the most. I've been expecting, Project Veritas or someone to come after me, but for some reason, those are the readings that people enjoy the most. Back to the question. Now, the difficulty with saying like where was he wrong is that like that category of error is so ambiguous because sometimes errors are either necessary and other times errors are only errors when we look back in time. And maybe they weren't errors at that time. Maybe just the context changed. And I think a big part of what I can say about Marx's errors is that the context changed. Now, one of the central, I guess, mistakes that the early Marx had was that he applied the historical schema that he had seen in his study, his very thorough study of European history, what we now historical material, this linear schema of you have primitive communism, then you have slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and then socialism or communism. He applied the schema to the rest of the world. And I think that was a violation of the dialectical materialist methodology itself, because the methodology tells you have to study each concrete situation concretely. Now, this mistake that appears in his early texts in 47 with the manifesto's published in 48. It appears in the German ideology, which is 46, 47, and it appears all the way up to really Capital, the first edition in 67. In the first preface, he talks about the universal character of the expansion of capital. Now, what he ends up doing in his later years, as he's studying anthropology, as he's studying ethnography, and these different fields, is finding out that copy-paste thing that he did with the history of Europe to the rest of the world, that was a mistake, right? And his friends, specifically Russian anthropologist friends, Maxim Kovalevsky, he was a prominent one. He was a student of Lewis Morgan, or Henry Louis Morgan. I always invert them. He was talking in his studies of the Incas about like feudalism or a peasant class, right? And Marx was like, look, I really appreciate the information you brought out, but you've gotten these categories that I have used to describe Europe, and you've copied and pasted them in completely different contexts. And so in that study of these different regions of the world, he ends up coming to different conclusions. Some like the fact that, capitalism is not necessary in Russia, because they have these the traditional communities that have community values. If they engage with the Western markets and are able to somehow get a hold of the forces of production from the West, they're able to have an advanced form of communism in their struggle with capital. They don't have to go through the capitalist stage, which is one of the things that he had always said, right? He doesn't publish on this because it's, we just see this now through manuscripts, but although it didn't happen in Russia, right? Now this information is being taken up in Latin America, in Bolivia, and in the countries that have big indigenous populations, since those communities still have those bonds, those communistic bonds, or the communistic ethos, as Jose Carlos Mariátegui used to call it, that Marx had seen in Russia. And so what's very interesting in terms of Marxist scholarship, something that we don't engage here in the US, is the Marxist scholarship that's arising out of Bolivia and these different countries that have achieved socialism that are using these later manuscripts to analyze how already knew that socialism wasn't just going to necessarily have to have a long stage of capitalism as it did in Europe, which breaks some of the linear historical schemas that have been prevalent in our tradition. I mentioned the dialectical and historical materialism book. I can't remember if I mentioned it here in the stream. Someone had recommended some readings for dialectical materialism, but from that schema, that's one of the mistakes that I pull out, that it follows this linear schema. Of course, the old manuscripts weren't known at that time, but it's one of these mistakes that considered it a mistake because he changed his mind at the end, but he wasn't able to publish on it. But that's one of the main places. And I would say the other one is imperialism, which he isn't really able to flush out as thoroughly as Lenin and Bukharin were able to do in the following century. And obviously socialism. He has certain bits here and there where he talks about socialism, what he thinks it's going to look like, but the process of the struggle for socialism in countries like China, Cuba, the USSR proved that some of those ideas weren't too realistic, that there were certain things that had to be focused on first, like sovereignty, which required the development of the forces of production, especially in the countries in the third world that had their revolutions, the development of the sciences, the technology, keeping some sort of functionaries. And like Mao, one of the most brilliant categories that he brings is a difference in expropriation, right? There's a difference in expropriating political capital, which you have to do, take away the political power of the capitalists and of the possessing classes, versus economic capital. You can let economic capital play around, develop the forces of production, as long as it's under the control of the party and of the people, and used to serve the interests of common prosperity.
And if
Sorry,
you
that was
look, oh, sorry. If you look at towards the end of Marx's life, too, he is starting to look at the colonial question more and more. He is starting to look at imperialism, capital's tendency to monopolize and expand and look elsewhere and trying to capture markets abroad. But he just, like, you know, Marxism is supposed to analyze the world around us, and he wouldn't see capitalism develop into the same imperialist stage that Lenin would. Versus then Lenin sees World War I, where all of the countries, the capitalist imperialist countries, are drawn into this horrible, bloody conflict as they're fighting each other for, you know, imperial plunder over the colonies. And he extends Marx's analysis and his analysis of capitalism to its next stage, its imperialist stage. So, you know, part of it is just the fact that, you know, the context and the time that he was living in.
Well, so that actually, I think, segues into like the idea for the broader panel, because everything you're saying is relative to, obviously, like you said, the context and time in which Marx was living. But if Marx was alive now, what things would he be saying? What would Marx sound like if he was talking to us on this panel right now?
Well, high as fuck for one.
You think he'd be just blazing?
Oh yeah,
Is that the right question though? I feel like that's such a weird thing. I that's the problem I feel like with a lot of these things that are centralized around like a single person. I see the same thing with, like, we talk about evolution and stuff. People start talking about Darwin, and it's like, well, I don't really care about Darwin. We've like moved so much like more beyond what Darwin is. Like, we're studying evolution now. So is that really the question to ask? Is it more like broader? Like, are we studying critical theory, or like how would you place like how we apply these things now?
I think Marx would be in China studying with, you know, the most advanced Marxists and dialecticians. Kind of like you said, like, you know, Darwin might be studying with biologists today, you know, based on the information that we've collected since then. Like, Marxism as a science has advanced so much in China with their contradiction analysis and other things like that. Maybe Carlos can talk about it more. But yeah, I mean, Gabriel Rockhill, who we've mentioned a few times, has a really good way of describing Marxism as a living, breathing science or social science, you know, or a project that everybody is contributing to try and alleviate these things like poverty, hunger, homelessness, all the ills of our of class society and our mode of production. So, you know, it sort of started with Marx, I guess. Not even. I mean, it started with built his theories on. But yeah, there's been so much added to the collective history of Marxism since then. I think Marx would just be doing his best to add more to it.
Yeah, I think Professor Richard Wolff also has talked about this in the past about how like there's such a like wide breadth of Marxist history and the different regions of the world where it's been practiced and tried and experimented that saying, well, this is the Marxist analysis or the Marxist critique of this and that. Well, you've got to be very hyper specific because there's Eastern Marxist philosophies, there's those within Central and South America Marxist philosophies. So there is no like, what can Marxism teach us? It's what does Marxism's lineage bring about today that we can utilize?
That's to maybe
Yeah, I
expand on that
often
last
mess
point.
around and I often mess around and I ask the same question, but I do it with Lenin. But so what would Lenin do? But what would Marx do if he was here today? First, he'd be a very different Marx, especially if we get him right when he died. Like if he just resurrects, he'd be a different Marx than the one we know because he shaved and got a haircut in Algeria before he died.
Are we getting
Well, that's the
journalist
first thing.
Marx? Or are we getting like camping out in Engels like farmhouse Marx? Which one are we talking about?
Well, he towards the end of his life, he was very interested in anthropology, in ethnography. He was interested in history. He was trying to write this really big book about the history of Europe. And him and Engels were always interested in the sciences, which is something that we don't find in Marxist scholars here. I personally, I can't say, besides perhaps Professor Q now, any person who publishes in the West on Marxism, who keeps up with the sciences. Maybe Professor Riggins, who's the counseling editor in our project, but Marx and Engels kept up with all the sciences. Engels was one of the first people to read Darwin's The Origins of Species. He was sending Marx letters about the book a week after it was published. Right. So they kept up with all the sciences, which is, something different than, most people in the West, at least in Western Marxism, don't do. But what would they do? Well, I think that they'd be doing, not to toot our own horn, but similar things to what we're trying to do, which is, cast the net as wide as possible, engage with people via 1 minute long TikToks, via long podcasts, via scholarly journals, books, articles, in any way possible, to educate the masses. They'd realize that, look, we have really dire conditions right now in the U.S. Half of the working class is a lost paycheck planet, right? So they'd see that the conditions, objectively, the objective conditions are there, the subjective conditions are missing. And how do you fix that? You fix that through education. You fix that through organizing so that the organization is not just this weird mass that just rises up spontaneously and then diffuses with the same speed it rose, but so that it's an organized body that has ends, that understands the reasons behind the specific outbursts that the masses have, and so that from that concrete understanding, it can postulate ways forward. That's what I think he'd say. We have class consciousness. We have to inform people so that they have a good theoretical grasp of the existing order, of how they're getting fucked by it, and of the fact that it's historical in nature, right? Capitalism hasn't always existed, even though for many of us, it feels like things have always been this way. If we know it hasn't always existed, we know that we can change it, because at some point people changed it so that it could be what it is now. So that's what I think he'd be telling us.
So let's go to our kind of brief text exchange we had while I was busy shopping for groceries. What are some tools? I kind of you mentioned the internet, right? So is that a tool that we can use for change? Is that, what does change look like? Because I got to tell you, I look at some of the shit that I look at, from right-wing extremism to conspiracism, and I have to stop myself sometimes from taking the black pill, because it's just, it's so fucking dire and things are getting so fucking bad. And I'm 40 now, and shit's gotten worse than when I was in high school. And I thought, you know, everybody told me my whole fucking life, it's going to get better. Don't worry. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, sorry, rant.
I think as conditions continue to deteriorate, like you said, it's going to push more and more people into, you know, political action or into organizing. I mean, for me, it was watching Republican governor like bust up the teachers' collective bargaining rights and cut my parents' paycheck and then give a giant subsidy to a multinational corporation. So there's more and more people who are being directly screwed by the political system, which is becoming increasingly autocratic. So yeah, like people are ripe for this message. You know, the message just isn't getting to them. There's all these different ways to block the message from getting to them. Including, you know, control. We just published a video recently. TikTok recently hired psychological operations officers at NATO. They're former operatives at NATO to manage their content. You know, so there's this message is systematically being withheld from people. But we had a buddy who was in our labor club in college, diehard communist, who went into the union recently in a blue collar union, and he's already worked his way to like the top of his union, and he's working to get a new or bargain for better benefits and stuff, because, you know, even though his workplace is mostly people who consider themselves Trump supporters, they know they're getting screwed by their boss, you know, and all they needed was somebody to go in there, know how the union works, study how the union worked, and get people active in the union, and all of a sudden they're directly, you know, fighting the company, fighting their boss for change. And that's possible. We're seeing, you know, increased unionization efforts. But it's going to take a mass movement, and it's going to take organization. Like Carlos said, it cannot be spontaneous. Like spontaneity is largely overrated when it comes to revolutions. You know, what we need is like strong organization and a clear, concise theoretical message. And we need to take a mass line. You know, we need to ally with groups of people, even if we don't agree on everything, you know, when our interests are in common.
Yeah, I first off, I wanted to tip my hat off to Professor Q because of the research that you do in the conspiracy.
No, don't. I'm a mere fucking mortal. Like
I try to.
We're only a man.
I have to tip my hat because it's incredible. But here's the thing. I think that part of it. I think that part of it. There's a silver lining in it, which is that people realize something about the existing order is fucked up. Okay, and here's the bad part. We who have the answers for why it's fucked up are not doing our job, and so they're going to these people. Is it Q? Is that QAnon? Is this one guy Q? You know, they're going into these conspiracy theories for a reason, because we're not there to give them the message of why it is that they feel like their life fucking sucks. So I think that in part, this move towards conspiracy theories and even the move towards Trump, right, to them, when we were in Iowa, a lot of these people, for them, make America great again meant make America how it was when my parents and grandparents were around, where we had good paying jobs. Well, for some parts of the working class, we had good paying jobs. You know, we could have a few vacations throughout the year. There was no debt to drown us if we got sick or if we tried to get an education, right? That's for a lot of them what it meant. And they voted for Trump almost like a protest vote. So I think that what we, in the face of this turn towards conspiracy theories, of this weird turn towards the right, we have to capitalism in crisis breeds fascism. If we don't want fascism to emerge, we have to do our job, which means we can't just cancel the people, the workers that are going to that area. We can't just cancel them.
This book.
Because if we cancel them and don't talk to them, if we don't talk to them, who are they going to go to? Fucking fascist. We have to go there, talk to them, give them our message, and explain to them why it is that the things they don't like about their everyday life is tied to capitalism, not to immigrants, not to Muslim people, not to gay people, not to LGBT it's tied to capitalism. The same person which screws them at work is screwing the other groups which they are pinning them against. But we're not doing that. A big portion of the left is not doing that. If they see conservative workers, they don't want to approach them because they have this, what I've been trying to develop in my work as a purity fetish. If it is not pure, I'm not going to talk to them. If they don't agree with me on every social issue, if they don't check off every single one of my grocery shopping list of politics, I can't talk to them. And that's a big mistake because part of what we're doing, as Mao said, is brainwashing. So the people are not in the right place. We have to put them at the right place mentally. So that strategy I cannot talk to people who disagree with me it's doomed to failure, eternal failure. It's the myth of Sisyphus, but with the failed left.
I have a bit of ethnographic field work that I can kind of explain to you. So I'm living in this really small town, Galesburg, Illinois, teaching at a private liberal arts university. It's where a lot of kids who are well-to-do go. One of my students, to give you an example, her mom worked in the FBI. She was pretty high up. Another student was he grew up with one of the Freakonomics guys, if you know who they are. Great place, smart kids, loved it. But, wherever I go, I have to live in the town. And I'll never forget this. I'm at this little diner, and that's where I get all my work done, by the way. It was about a pot of coffee and a fucking omelet. That's the best place to do work. But there's this older lady there, and she's, we kind of get a conversation going, and she's like, so what do you do here in town? And I said, well, I'm, a professor at Knox College. And she goes, well, you're not a mean person like the rest of them. And it occurred to me, there's this divide in that town, this very, very, very small town, Galesburg, Illinois, between the college and the people who live there. The people who live in the town are primarily working class, but the college, they make a good amount of money for an assistant. I was making the most I ever made there as a visiting assistant professor. And that's saying a lot, right? But yeah, it just to kind of illustrate your point about this kind of social divide and how I've experienced it. And I've experienced it everywhere I've ever lived when I came out of grad school because I've been in the Midwest.
Carlos, I totally agree with you, man. I think it's really interesting how social media now is being used as with the working class are fighting one another, ratting each other out, trying to lose you're going, people are going after one another, trying to lose their jobs or defame them eternally, man. It's not just you said something bad. It's no, you deserve to be canceled entirely. And it's it sucks, man. I feel like these people are being exploited. They're being brainwashed, by and I feel I don't know. I feel it's just very weird to have these huge companies that are sitting there, and it seems like they're just making us all infight. While here we are, Bezos is just making tons of money, on Twitch, Google, another one of the biggest companies in the world, on YouTube, and here we are trying to rat each other out, and it's I don't know. It just doesn't sit with me well.
We had people canceling us at one point for something or other, and then the people canceling us were demanding that people send them Venmo, a bunch of Venmo, to pay them for their emotional labor that it took them to cancel us. That's kind of the spot that we're in. And it is terrible if the working masses see that as Marxism. If they see cancel culture liberalism as Marxism, because that's never been Marxism. It has nothing to do with Marxism. It's completely toxic to any kind of collective organizing.
Exactly. It's a workers' rights issue, right? Where it's these people deserve the ability. I don't know. It's just what I see in the future is that companies like Google and Amazon are going to use anti-capitalist rhetoric to fire people on the dot. They're just going to turn it, and they're going to say that now you're anti-capitalist. Now you're going to be canceled.
Okay. So I'm going gonna push back a
I
little
hate
bit,
that.
Greg. So the cancel culture doesn't affect like normal working class people. That's a non-existent issue for them. Even for those who are within like the higher capitalist class and people who are like still workers, entertainers, but kind of have ascended their class position. Cancel culture doesn't affect them either, right? You getting your ass chewed out in the QRTs is not like threatening your career. Real cancel culture is people who are in higher positions at workplaces that actually can just cancel, fire you, give you the streets on a whim. Right to work states. That's cancel culture. I don't buy into this like well, capitalists are going to use like woke cancel culture frameworks in order to just like gut their workforce.
I have one anecdote from our buddy who went into the union and is organizing his union. He had a coworker who called another coworker a cocksucker, and he was suspended without pay for 2 weeks for using a homophobic term. So in some ways it is the language policing is directly used to crack down on the working class. But I think
And
I
not
think
just
you make some good points. But yeah, in some cases I think it
and
is
not
used like that.
and not just in terms of like here at home. It's used, for lack of a better word. I'm sorry that the right uses it, but wokeism. It's at the center of like a left-wing legitimation of imperialism, right? If you look at the narratives that come from like the left liberal sections that are pro-imperialist, they're all tied to, in one form or another, identity politics. So Cuba in 2021, seeing Black and BIPOC artists, right? They were very specific, the type of artists that they were. They don't talk about the fact that these artists had millions and millions of dollars shoveled in from the NED and from USAID in order to sing what they were singing. That's never mentioned, but whatever. They're oppressing Black people. Venezuela, they're oppressing LGBTQ people. Where's the evidence? I don't know. They got as much evidence as we have for Santa Claus. China, the Uyghur issue, same thing. It's already been confirmed by the UN that it was bullshit. But it's a Uyghur minority. Putin, okay, maybe there they have some stuff, right? But in order to legitimize for a left-leaning liberal audience imperialism, they've been using this wokist discourse. And what it does is removes the substance of the struggles of oppressed and marginalized communities, whose interest is not with capitalism. Their interest is not in diversifying the exploiting class. Their interest is in overthrowing the whole existing order. And that's why these struggles for liberation, national liberations, these struggles of anti-racism, all of these struggles have always been tied, feminist struggles, they've always been tied with anti-capitalism and with the struggle for socialism. But that's not what we're finding now. We have the FBI that just raised the pride flag. We have the last CIA video where they made it very explicit, a lesbian, intersectional, feminist woman of color who feels at home in the agency. The agency that has been responsible for the coups in the third world and killing countless of Black folk phenomenon. And we can't just go with the ostrich tactic of sticking our head in the sand and forget about it, or call everyone who brings it up a bigot for bringing it up, right? Because we bring it up in a comradely manner because we're trying to understand the situation concretely, and we can't ignore the fact that it's being used, and we have to criticize it because it's not just detrimental for socialism and for the anti-imperialist struggle, but for the struggle of oppressed and marginalized communities as well, because it ties their liberation to merely being able to have an opportunity that only a very small amount of them will have to be part of the exploiting and oppressing class.
Well, these like kind of liberal aesthetics, weaponization of identity politics, that are done by like the main apparatuses of the imperial core. These are done to remove the ability for the regular worker to be able to contextualize why is Halliburton suddenly so gay friendly. Well, if they're gay friendly, if they're rainbow and trans flags on our our B-52 bombers, well, they can't be that bad, It's the inability for people to be able to contextualize it, and they don't have the vocabulary because of the pedagogy that they're subjected to within America. They don't have a way to describe these things. Everyone, I think, in America who is a worker does recognize the conditions that are subjected upon them, and does recognize that there is a broader apparatus that is, intentionally fucking them over. But like with any kind of reactionary country, are scapegoated into minorities, immigrants, anyone who's outside of the kind of puritanical traditionalist values that exist within a country like America. Yeah, it all comes back to education and agitative propaganda.
Agreed.
Oh, sorry, I blacked out. What was that?
No, I mean, I think it's one of those things where, like, when we have conversations with people who haven't read any of this, or who really just kind of like consume the daily nightly news and CNN articles and NPR pieces and stuff like that, we kind of have to reiterate those points, especially for people who belong to marginalized groups. Like they have to say, my existence is not something that should be weaponized by capitalist powers to perpetuate itself, but rather, acknowledged in the struggle for our collective solidarity and economic justice. And these things go hand in hand. You can't really arrive at economic justice without an understanding of identity and how people come into their own identities and how that has shaped their material conditions. But at the same time, these things are interlinked. You can't have one without the other. You need to realize that you have to, at some point, focus on economy as opposed to simply dealing with liberalist aesthetics and focusing solely on identity. I mean, they're all important aspects, but it just feels like in America, especially, the powers that be, the capitalists, will absolutely lean into identity so long as their capital isn't touched, and create an illusion of progress, illusions of change.
I'll tell you, there's a lot of gay folk that I don't feel any solidarity with, because they will sell me out at the first possible chance, and have, actually. I did want to note, I did drop a link in the chat for a great film on pinkwashing. It's called Pride Denied. And the filmmaker basically goes through and shows how Pride has been turned into this multinational conglomerate. There's even a fucking group called Interpride that basically coordinates and organizes all of the prides around the world, right? The president of that must have a really great ego. But I went around the world, and I went to a lot of prides in the UK, in Berlin, in Dublin, and they all look the fucking same, right? Because they're all funded by these corporations who basically suck every ounce of creativity and spontaneity and protest out of them and turn them into these products so that they can have this identity politics, so that they can appear, progressive.
And it's so disgusting. We published an article in our Journal of American Socialist Studies about, the way that the CIA and the State Department during the Red Scare would, find communists and socialists who were gay and out them as gay publicly, or persecute them for those reasons, and use it as a way to persecute gay people on the left. But then, as soon as they think they can co-opt the LGBTQ message, to use it to maintain power, all of a sudden Halliburton and all these corporations are the biggest, pro-LGBTQ groups. It's like so disgusting, and you see they have no principles. It's whatever is in the best interest of their capital.
Just look at Black Lives Matter, how it's been turned into this thing, right? There's kind of a running gag, right? Black Lives Matter Inc., right? About how it's been kind of turned into the same kind of thing. Who was the artist who was basically selling shirts and pocketing the money?
I mean, the organization itself is
nutty,
got
dude.
a lot of like fucky stuff going on with it, but
hundreds of millions of dollars.
The org itself is weird, but the movement itself is 100% legitimate, of course.
No. I'm not saying that. I agree with the message, just how it's been kind of turned into this other kind of spectacle, right?
Aesthetic, yeah, it's so true. Yeah, man, it's like
I thought it was a hardcore Marxist organization. Isn't that what they?
Yeah, they're trained Marxists. They went under the waterfalls and practiced their shadow clone jutsus and stuff.
I like the
But
Naruto.
one of the, I
reference
think
Thank
one
you.
of the first, one of the first TikToks that Eddie made that went viral was a copy. You were messing around with a copy of Capital, and you opened it, and it said like, what was it?
It
You
said-
can explain it better. You did it.
I think I opened up Capital and I had written on a Sharpie on a piece of paper and taped it into Capital. It said like, Marxism is when you protest police brutality. BLM equals Joseph Stalin or something ridiculous like that. And I was like, oh my God, they were right. Like Karl Marx invented BLM. I think that's how we got big originally.
But that gets to another point. You had asked Professor Q about technology, and while it is something that it's pretty ambiguous because it helps us do things like what we're doing now, right? And what we do at Midwestern Marx, it provides a platform, a medium for us, revolutionary education, but it's always limited. It's always limited. We had the TikTok account. It had gotten to almost 400,000 followers. It had consistently videos just getting to 3, 4, 5 million views. He had a video responding to Jordan Belfort that had like close to 10 million views. And then what happened? It got in the summer of 2021 when things was going down in Cuba and we were agitating against the imperialist propaganda. We were getting suspended basically every week so that we couldn't speak. And then what happened with the Ukraine war, as soon as we started contextualizing some of the events, looking at the role that NATO has played and NATO expansion in the US and some of the things going on in Ukraine with certain Nazi elements, we got banned. We had that account, close to 400K followers, banned, off the earth. We hop on a second account, we have close to 50 there, banned, permanently banned, right? So we're up to what, the third, fourth fucking account? Every time you get big enough to be dangerous, gone. So that it creates a paradox because you have to be there. You have to be there informing the masses because that's where people are. They go on their phone but as soon as you get big enough, you're gone.
That's kind of wild. That's a great illustration of your point, actually.
And now we know that NATO operatives are literally working at TikTok. It's even more like,
That's fucked up.
yeah.
I'm taking notes and I wrote all this down because after we're done here, I want to go look some of this stuff up just because I'm like fascinated by all this.
Mint Press News were the ones who published about the NATO operatives at Twitter and TikTok. They have they do a lot of great work.
So here, let me, because I kind of wanted to take things in a little bit of a different direction. I think this is more just kind of expanding upon like how people feel right now and a lot of sentiment that I've heard in some leftist circles. I don't know really like how much Carlos and Eddie, you've really talked about the notion of accelerationism, but it feels like, at least from a far right perspective, I think Carlos, you mentioned this before, like as things continue to evolve into fascism, you're getting a far right branded accelerationism where everything deteriorates, the vibes fall apart, and people get killed. So that's what it kind of feels like right now. But I hear a lot of like left-leaning people of various flavors essentially say like, well, let's just lean into it. People will eventually, just come to Marxism naturally as, capitalism contradicts itself and things fall apart. Can you like maybe offer some like grounded academic pushback to that idea? Or if you agree with it, maybe like it, why would that, like, what is there any truth in there?
Take that one. Sorry.
Although we use the lingo in Marxism of the inevitability of socialism, it's mainly for agitational reasons. In reality, what we can say is that capitalism creates the conditions for socialism, right? They're here now. They're here now, right? These great monopolies, all you got to do is nationalize them, right? All you got to do is nationalize them. But creating the conditions for socialism isn't making socialism inevitable. So this accelerationist perspective, I disagree with it. It's similar to, it has a similar flaw of the economism that Lenin criticized at the turn of the last century, which only focused on spontaneity. And what's that flaw? That it denigrates the element of agency, that it's humans who have to ideologically align themselves with the socialist project so that they use those conditions which capitalism creates to overthrow the existing order, right? So I don't think that accelerationism is really an option. The only option we really have is education, organization. We already have, we're pushed against a timeline that no other socialist generation did, which is climate change, right? That just intensifies what it is that we have to do. So just letting things go until, people are forced to act, I don't think that's an option, right? People are, they might hit the streets, but if they don't know what it is they're fighting, if they think they're fighting a specific capitalist or specific policies or specific politicians, it's not going to do anything.
I think you bring up a good point, Carlos. Like, things are going to accelerate regardless, as in the conditions are going to change, and capitalism is going to continue to do its thing and exploit people worse. Like, we've seen that since Reagan. In the 40 years of neoliberalism, trickle down economics, things have progressively gotten worse year after year. So I think regardless of how fast things accelerate in that direction, our job remains the same. To educate, organize, and agitate. And yeah, I like that you bring up climate change, because that kind of makes it clear, like, we have no choice. It's literally socialism or barbarism. Socialism or capitalism could destroy our planet.
Yeah, I mean,
which is just to add there, it's one of those areas where people didn't know that Marxism had touched. The Marxist ecological analysis is very very rich. I don't know if the scientists in the room have been able to engage with the work of like John Bellamy Foster, Ian Angus, but Marx and Engels are so up to date with the sciences. Their critiques of climate change and the role that capitalism has in the environment quite stellar, and they're based on science, right? Justice von Liebig and different scientists that they were constantly in contact with, sometimes even personally, just having some of the leading scientists in Britain coming in and out of the Marx or the Engels household. I've been trying to focus in my personal research on this field of Marxist ecology and the work of Foster. I'm currently reviewing this Bible-sized fucking book, The Return of Nature, but it does have a long and rich tradition, and it's one of those areas that's, again, often not known. It's a little better since Foster published Marxist Ecology 20 years ago. But yeah.
By the way, I got to give him a plug since you brought this up. If you're interested in somebody in our region doing this kind of work, look up Bob Antonio. So he's been running these sessions at the Midwest Social meetings for a really long time on basically environmental sociology. And, I was like, I'm really interested in this culture industry stuff, and I'm really interested in this other stuff. And I started going to his sessions, and I realized, oh shit, yeah, there's a whole kind of Marxist critique of nature that I didn't really quite understand. And he, in his presentations and in his written work, he makes it really accessible. So if you're looking for another source, and he's very approachable too. So
I'll have to check that out. Carlos, what was the Ian Angus or Ian Agnes book that we read for that one class? That one's pretty approachable.
Facing the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
He's the Angus fellow. He's the editor at Climate and Capitalism. It's a connected project to Monthly Review. But in this field, I'd say check out the School of Monthly Review, because it's the essence of their Marxism, and it's extremely rich. I encountered it by mistake in my research. I primarily research Hegel and dialectics, and I encountered it by mistake, but it just gripped me to the point where I couldn't let go of the book, and I've kept on researching in that field for the last few months. But it's one of the things I mentioned that I think that I did, when you do something else and you can't remember where it was that you said it, because we were streaming for like 20 minutes before we hopped on. But I think I mentioned earlier the fact that Western Marxism, it almost rejects an involvement in the sciences. And in this moment with climate change and the battle against the clock, there's nothing more dangerous than that, especially when we have this rich tradition of Marxist critique of the effects that capitalism has on the environment. We have to engage with it. We have to engage with the sciences. And I don't think that existing instruments of Marxist theory in the West are really up to the task. We need to revolutionize how we think of Marxism. Well, I think I'm frozen.
You're back now.
You're back.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just something you guys said earlier. All I can tell you is within sociology, even the work that I do is pretty marginalized. So, like, you mentioned something about QAnon earlier. I'm not going to tell you the journal, but I did send it to a journal, top journal that deals with social problems. And they told me it wasn't a significant social problem. So there you go. Anyway, I think someone else.
I heard.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No, just related to that, real quick. I heard one of the more respected historians for Marxist-Leninists, Grover Furr. He replied to an article from Capital and Class, which, as I'm sure you know, is one of the more prominent Marxist journals out of England, where the article was promoting quite literally a falsehood. And this is a person that reads Russian, that was able to access the archives in Russia, and he did a reply to it, a commentary on the article, and they wouldn't publish it because of political reasons, right? So even the journals that claim to be Marxist actively exclude this perspective that accepts previous socialist projects.
Well, so I mean, speaking of journals, I know Professor Q actually touched on this when he was introducing both of you. You're creating your own actual like peer-reviewed journal. Could you maybe just like elaborate more on that as it pertains to like what you're actually wanting to publish? Simply because like, at least from like my perspective in hard sciences, it feels very almost like weird to hear like a journal that publishes Marxist stuff. Like I'm used to just like raw biology or chemistry or something just being stuck in there. Like how does that manifest, and like what is the overlap between sort of like the more philosophical political stuff you're wanting to publish and maybe something in hard sciences? Like, is there any hard science material that you would ever consider publishing?
That would be awesome. We would love to do that. Yeah, do you want to, I mean, Carlos, we both work on the journal a lot, but maybe you're better suited to take that one.
Well, the journal is called the Journal of American Socialist Studies, and the specific task we're sort of trying to fulfill with the journal, that we already have one issue out from last year, but the specific task is sort of breaking the big lie that you have on one side America, on the other side you have socialism, and there's this impenetrable gulf between the two. And anything that has to do with the U.S. is just automatically anti-socialist. And we break that up in an interdisciplinary manner that shows the history of struggles for socialism, of anti-racist abolitionist struggles, of feminist struggles in the U.S., of radical struggles in general against capitalism, against empire, against colonialism. So that's what we're trying to do with that journal, just recapture the radical history of the U.S. And for instance, last journal, one of our articles was on the role that the German communists, we call them the 48ers, because they came after the revolutions of 1848, which was the event which Marx wrote the manifesto. Marx and Engels wrote the manifesto for. They played an incredible role in the early Republican Party and in the Civil War, right? Some of these people were very high-ranking officers, and they were communists, like outright communist Marxists. They had their own journals in the U.S., but we don't know this, right? We don't know this, and it's such an important event in our history. Some call it the Second American Revolution, and communists played a really big role. We had an article about that. I had an article on a fellow by the name of Langdon Bilsby, who was in 1826, 2 decades Marx and Engels were even publishing anything of of significance related to scientific socialism. This guy was trying to analyze capitalism systematically, understand it in some form of a scientific manner, and from there try to approach changing it, which is basically an attempt to develop scientific socialism in the US 20 years before Marx and Engels. It's huge, but no one knows who the hell Langdon Billsby is. So we have this very rich tradition of struggle, and we don't know it exists. And in the journal, we try to recapture that because I think that it gives our movement historical legs. It shows that, hey, we're not bringing something foreign to the U.S. Socialism is as American as apple pie, as Cornel West has said before. So we try to do that in a more academic sense in the journal.
Yeah, and I think we also want to give a platform because Marxist or radical politics is so marginalized in academia in the West and is systematically removed or rooted out from it. We want to give people a platform, and our last article, or our last journal had history articles, it had philosophy, and then mine was one in based on political science, or basically giving an analysis of foreign policy that I had always wanted to give but wasn't able to in my 4 years in the academy. And then, now the next one, I'm studying healthcare administration. I'll probably give, a systematic analysis of the American healthcare system, because the only people who are writing medical studies and medical journals in the field of healthcare administration right now are paid by giant healthcare conglomerates like United Health Group, who are commodifying healthcare and making billions of dollars off of it. So, they're going to push their policy experts who write these studies and publish this research on healthcare in a certain direction, So with our project, we give people a platform to publish something that's peer reviewed that they can put on their resume, as saying they published in an academic peer reviewed journal. But then it's also, pushing radical revolutionary politics and not censoring people.
Okay,
I can see the wheels turning on Marcus. We are working on a project jointly. I don't know if that's where your head was going, but it definitely was where mine was going.
Yeah, no, it was kind of going there. I think it depends, because there are some other more, I guess, media-esque outlets. They're not formal academic journals, so to speak, to put some of what we're thinking. But Professor Q, we can talk about that behind the scenes as to not spoil what we're up to. But in theory, it makes sense insofar as trying to establish an outlet for academic Marxist thought, for it to actively be published, simply because as you both have said, academia as a whole has kind of eschewed this entire way of thinking in favor of contemporary neoliberalism, where it's just more of an industry rather than an actual aggregate of thought and research. It's very commoditized insofar as publication. So it feels very refreshing that there is an initiative to try and actually take an academic journal and make it about this, simply because it doesn't exist. And even if it's not perfect in its early iterations, I think it's important that it does exist and continues to iteratively get better. So that's just something that I thought was refreshing to hear about that particular effort.
And Carlos, that's something Carlos has said from the beginning. That's been his brainchild, and all credit to him for that.
And it's I think it's part of this larger sort of approach that we take to what we do, which is cast the net as wide as you can, right? We've even done just funny meme-ish videos, right? Eddie has done skits before with his friends where he explains the labor theory of value very simply.
I searched Karl Marx. Sorry, I'll interject real quick. I searched Karl Marx the other day on YouTube, and I saw the first thing that pops up is my 197-pound teammate, or that's the weight class he wrestled in college. He's one of the best college wrestlers, or D3 wrestlers ever, doing something crazy like this. I'm why is this what comes up when I search Karl Marx? But it was the skit we did explaining how surplus value is taken when you create a commodity. And they got a bunch of views, but
with the sandal, right?
Yeah, it
was great.
It's one of my favorite videos we've ever made.
We go from those jokey style videos to an academic journal, a website that publishes serious material. And now we just inaugurated our publishing press almost 2 months ago. We just published a book, Reading the Classical Text of Marxism, from Thomas Riggins. He's a philosophy professor who has taught in NYU, New School for Social Research, CUNY. He's the counseling editor in our project. And he's had this project working on it for more than 2 decades, where he's been reading through the most important texts from Marx, Engels, and Lenin and doing commentary on them in a way that doesn't just explain it for everyday militants, people just getting into Marxism, but in areas where like Lenin and Engels talk about science, because he has kept up with the sciences, he says, where have the sciences gone? You know, where has this developed into? And similarly, politically, because this is a person that, has not just been in academia as a philosophy professor in major institutions, but he's been actively working in organizations like the Socialist Party in the 60s and then the Communist Party ever since then. So it's someone that has done scholarship, but also activism completely in a way that they're each is intermeshed. And we just published his book on it. So we want to continue that with the publishing press, where we're able to publish scholarly material on Marxism, on history, theory, philosophy, but also militancy documents, more agitational stuff. But it's great to, when you begin to see a sort of change in the atmosphere and how people react to things. I know that, Eddie, this is something that you've noticed from when you first got on TikTok to now, which is that the effects of supporting, say, China or something have changed. Before, it was just a bunch of people talking, just spewing propaganda. After these last 2 years, it's kind of changed. There's still people doing that, but
yeah, I think I don't know, I underestimate it sometimes, because it is easy to get nihilistic, I guess, when the propaganda is so strong. But it's crazy. I used to not even be able to mention Stalin or China, and now it's like, just expected, and there's a whole bunch of people doing it. It's yeah, there has been a definite shift, at least on the TikTok, which might just be a small group of people, but either way, it's been interesting to see.
All right, let me check in with one, the rest of the panel, and then two, both of you, Eddie and Carlos, just because we're approaching the 2 hour mark. So I guess, other panelists, is there any questions that have like been burning a hole in your cortex, like anything you want to ask?
I have a really stupid question, but I've been asking a lot of leftists this recently, and I've been kind of astounded by the range in answers. So, in your guys' opinion, what is the difference between communism and socialism, if any?
I would say, for Marx, he never, I don't think, distinguishes between socialism and communism. He basically thinks socialism is a lower stage of communism, and the more that socialism develops, the higher stage of communism you're getting into. But as Carlos said, some of Marx's ideas about what socialism would look like right away have had to have been tweaked with time, and especially with imperialism being the main contradiction. It makes it really hard to develop into a really high stage of communism, or it has. Countries have needed to focus on maintaining their sovereignty, building up their militaries, building up their productive forces so they don't have, famines and starvation, things like this. Because we're talking about, the Soviet Union, Cuba, and China. These were feudal or semi-feudal countries prior to their revolutions. So I think it's fair to say that they're in a stage of socialism, and they're looking to progress to a higher stage of socialism and change their system qualitatively into something different, like communism. Maybe that comes with the abolition of class or the abolition of wage slavery. What exactly that looks like, I don't know. And I think, for now, it's almost impossible to know, so long as the U.S. imperialist hegemon still is as powerful as it is. We are moving into a multipolar world, but, there's still a lot of progress to go. The U.S. is still very, very powerful in stopping the development of socialism everywhere. So I don't know. Maybe one of my theories that I've just thought about in my head to myself is that maybe once or eventually, if we have a revolution in every country, once or once a majority of countries in the world are socialist, they'll be able to work together and engage in trade policies of mutual development rather than destruction, and bring about a truly communist system without wage slavery. But it's a long way down the line. It's probably beyond our lifetime, and I guess it's the work of history to figure it out.
Yeah, well said. In terms of Marx, he does play with the distinction, but he doesn't make the distinction between socialism and communism, but between lower and higher stages of communism and the critique of the Gotha program, which then Lenin takes it up. And actually, before Lenin, William Morris, famous English artist and Marxist, he was the head of the Socialist League in England. He uses the distinction of the different stages, and he categorizes it as socialism is from each according to their ability, to each according to their work. Communism is from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, which was the famous phrase from the critique of the Gotha program, which actually had already popped up in the German ideology. But most people, when they read the German ideology, they just read part 1 and 2. It's actually really big, and it's in one of the latter sections. But the difference of what socialism and communism means is a historically loaded question, because it has changed. It changes a whole lot.
That's why it's fun to ask, because it gives a perspective on what that person chooses to focus their perspective in on. So that's why I've started asking leftists that, because it's always a little flavor difference. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's so at the turn of the century, they were all calling themselves social democrats, right? And today's social democrats, it's a whole nother thing, right? But I'd say that my response would be that today, in today's context, communism is when you accept the tradition of existing socialism. Socialism is when you hold some form of a view that socialism hasn't been tried before, actually. And that's the divide. When I see people calling themselves socialists, they're that reject the socialist countries and the socialist revolutions that took place. When I see people calling themselves communists, they're usually the ones that accept those revolutions from the past and that are currently taking place and constructing a socialist project right now. But those revolutions themselves, they think of their projects as the construction of socialism, right? China is very clear that they're in a very low stage of socialist development. So again, the meaning of the words changes in the context, both historical and geographically.
So I'm curious, I that was awesome. Thank you for that perspective. I'm really curious about how you guys run Midwestern Marx, because there is a lot of people and their staff and stuff like that. So, I mean, how are you running this organization, based off of your principles?
Xi Jinping wires us money and tells us what to do.
I knew it. I knew it.
Too?
Yeah.
Nice.
I mean,
Okay.
Putin faxes me a script, and I read him on TikTok. It takes me an hour, and then I spend the rest of the day just blowing the money that he gives us.
Of course, a dingus would use a fax machine.
I'm curious, you guys have them probably. Is it democratically run? Are there any problems that you've had in the organization? Just just day-to-day problems that you've had. What can we learn from your own organization?
Yeah, it'd be impossible to run democratically just because of the amount of labor that goes in. I guess you could say just because Carlos and I, it's our baby, I guess, and we put in a lot of work, and then we have some editors like Mitch, Mitchell Jones, Kala Winchell, Alex Zambito, and then Thomas Riggins. They all put in a lot of work too, and there are other people. Noah Krachevik is another one. So, but we couldn't necessarily do it democratically because not everyone has time. What? What's that?
Well, I'm sorry. I think there's a lag, but I said that he's going to kill you for pronouncing his last name like that.
Dude, I can't figure it out. He's tried to explain to me how to pronounce it, but I can't do it. My pronunciations are terrible. But so a lot, obviously Carlos and I have to make a lot of decisions. But what we do try and consult the editorial board when we have big decisions, and there have been, I guess, our biggest learning moments have come generally like on social media or Twitter when we end up inciting or getting in the middle of a giant debate, which sometimes leads to splits between people who we mostly agree with. So, we've had to change our tactics, not in that, we shy away from our principles, but, we're the way that we present our arguments has changed, when it comes to the most controversial issues that tend to start flame wars or whatever you call them, Twitter battles that lead to splits, because we want to mostly unite people and mostly stay away from that stuff so far as it gets ugly and leads to splits. So that's one thing that I think we've done.
Yeah, and in terms of like the website, I handle like the editing emails. So the articles that come in, I sent them out to the editorial board according to the topic of the article and what the person specializes in. So if it's philosophy, it's usually something that either I or Thomas Riggins are review. If it's political science, Eddie, and it goes according to what the person specializes in terms of the review process. We were having like editorial board meetings twice a month. We've had a little less, but we've all stayed in contact. When there's major decisions, when there's an article that after reviewing, we don't know if we should publish or not just because of the content might be too polemical, we always bring it up to everyone and we have everyone give a vote. And according to the majority, we end up deciding on what to do. Before we can bring someone into the editorial board, we have everyone vote them in, right? So that there's no one that has a problem with the person coming in. We also have a writing staff of folks that are free to write, an article a day or just write once every 3-4 months. And a lot of those folks are quite active, but usually the ones that are the most invested in the project are the editorial board, who are also usually participating in creating video content as well and guiding interviews. And like Noah, we just added him to the editorial board a month ago. He's got a series on YouTube called 1 Minute Marx, which has been kind of a running joke because none of them have been a minute. they've all been like 4 or 5 minutes, and when people bring it up, we just tell them that's bourgeois
propaganda.
Yeah,
repeating imperialist lies. They're all a minute or less.
But it's an interesting series because he's active on Twitter, and he snipes out different forms of misusing traditional Marxist-Leninist concepts. And what he does in the 1 Minute Marx series is explain the misunderstanding and then what it actually has meant in the tradition. So it's been super, super informative and a very good at doing baseline educational stuff that sometimes Eddie and I are not really interested in doing too much because we have our own research areas that we're focusing on. But yeah, in terms of structure, that's mostly it. When it comes to like the publishing press, we do have we try to have one consistent set of eyes in the manuscripts that we're currently engaging with, and then when that's done, we have someone else like reread the whole manuscripts to make sure that there's no errors and stuff like that. So organizationally, that's basically how we function. And Eddie runs the TikTok. Yeah.
Marcus and I jumped because someone just gave a bunch of gift subs.
Yeah, sorry. No, that gave me a small heart attack. My chat was blowing up. Continue. Sorry. Or
what is one of your favorite like misconceptions about like Marx or the left or something like that? Is there anything that you just like see repeated all the time that you get really frustrated with?
I see it in class. You can go if you want, Eddie. Sorry.
Is it socialism is when the government does stuff, and the more stuff it does, the more socialist it is, and when it does a real lot of stuff, it's communism?
That one's an interesting one. I mean, I think.
No good, sir.
I don't. You go ahead, Carlos. I'm trying to think. I had one in mind. I lost it.
Well, I would say that socialism is when everyone is equally poor. That's one of the big things that I debunk in class. And when people realize that, no, Marx wanted the forces of production to develop, Marx wanted such abundance so that people can work voluntarily, so that their work is a creative social expression that embraces a rational dialectic with the metabolism of society and nature. When you explain this to people and they're like, wait, socialism isn't about sharing toothbrushes? No, it's not. It's about making everyone wealthy, but wealth considered as creating the conditions for human flourishing,
Yeah, that
not just for the
McCarthyism.
flourishing of capital.
Yeah, that McCarthyism Red Scare propaganda is a bitch.
It is. I guess my number one misconception would just be the idea that socialism has failed. Because, and you know, all the different ways that people bring up to try and prove that, because a lot of my research is focused, you know, on the history of socialism and looking at countries like China, and they have the fastest increase in standard of living that's ever been seen in human history in the first 10 years of Mao. It's like, how can you just look at that and say it's failed? Like, oh, there was a famine. Like, what about the years and years and years of famines that came before that? Like, you know, they'll point to Cuba and say, oh, they have less money than America. It's like, oh, do they? They've been under an embargo for 70 years. You know, they were a semi-feudal colonized country that basically had slavery until 1959 when they overthrew the US-backed gangster who was running the country. And now they have universal health care, and they've built schools and hospitals in rural areas. Are you going to tell me that socialism hasn't worked for the farmers in those areas? Like, you know, as Michael Parenti says, to say socialism has never worked is to ignore the fact that it has for millions and millions of people. And I just like am mind boggled by these arguments. Like, well, the Soviet Union had gulags. Like, okay, at the height of the gulags, they had far less prisoners than we have in the American prison systems today. You know, and they're like, oh, well, they had slave labor. It's like even in the gulags, they gave them a living wage though. Here in the U.S. prisons, you're allowed to pay prisoners oftentimes less than $1 an hour, and there are weapons manufacturers who use that, and other corporations as well. You know, so just this idea that socialism's failed and all the different ways people try and say that it has. It's just such a big lie that's so important, I think, to debunk too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
There's
I
so
always
many.
like to look at Cuba whenever it's someone's trying to make the argument. It's like, well, if socialism has failed, if communism has always failed, then a country that's been under embargo for 60 years should have crumbled into dust by now, and they still seem to be alive and kicking. Got a lung cancer vaccine, you know. Seems like something's going good. I mean, I wouldn't make the argument that China or Cuba or any country is socialistic, like at all, particularly China, but you know, there are elements of socialist ideals that still exist even within like the Western world.
yeah. Well, and that's a point that like, and I think Greg, you asked this. Like, I'm glad you brought that up because I encounter a lot of that Red Scare-esque propaganda in academic circles, especially because a lot of the people that sort of dictate and govern conversations are, you know, crusty old white professors who have been, you know, raised on that like it's fucking breast milk. So, you know, from my perspective, I just hear a lot of that shit constantly. And a way that I like to frame it, Greg, you can sort of comment on that notion of like experimentation, almost from like a literal hard science perspective. Like, just because you do an experiment in a laboratory and it fails doesn't mean you abandon the entire research question. You tweak variables, you change the system, you change what you're working with, you change the reagents, or maybe, you know, a different set of people go forth and do the experiment. So you can maybe think about it that way, insofar as, you know, how, at least in this country, we sort of apply the, you know, socialist ideas and, you know, experimental successes, and we try and integrate those into our society to improve material conditions without actually bringing about places where or policies rather that haven't really been the best and have led to overt failure. You know, I think we can try and extract the best things from it and apply those where we can, just as we do in the hard sciences, right? We take a look at what works, we develop new techniques, and we use that to increase our understanding. And that's why I think we can use that when we're talking within our own spheres of academia, that rhetoric.
And what's unfortunate is when you have these Marxists or so-called Marxists who like just dogmatically dismiss anything that China or Cuba or these countries have done. You know, China's poverty alleviation programs, which have been recognized by the UN as like the most incredible poverty alleviation programs ever carried out. when you just dogmatically dismiss these countries as evil, totalitarian dictatorships that there's nothing to learn from, you miss out on this debate that these countries are constantly having within themselves. You know, China's constantly looking at their history and saying, what did we do wrong? What could we do better? And if I've been reading a lot of Mao lately and reading about the debate that was going on within the party and within China right after the revolution when they were first trying to construct socialism. And they're looking at the specifics, you know, down to the very most minute or the most minute detail as to what the Soviet economic policy was and what the results of the Soviet economic policy was. And then they're using that to create their own economic policy and tweaking it based on what they learn. I mean, so that's a specific example about countries building socialism. But I mean, yeah, there's so much to learn from the experiments of the past and the organizing efforts of the past. And if you just dogmatically dismiss it all as wrong and bad, I mean, I think you miss out on learning a lot from that debate.
And we're also speaking, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the exclusion of Marxism from academia. We're also speaking from the place where there's the least Marxism about the place where there's the most Marxism. China, new journals popping up every fucking day. New institutes for Marxist research, new everything. Meanwhile, the humanities here are getting sucked dry, but you know, they have scholarship just rising up and rising up and rising up. There's so many debates, and that's one of, you know, to talk again about the myths, right? One of the myths is that you can't critique X, Y, or Z. You can't critique the government. No, the government is the most critical of the government because they realize that if you don't do self-critique, you can't overcome the contradictions that are currently existing, and you can't progress, and you're going to fall. Right, so the debates that take place in China are just brilliant. The ones that take place in Cuba. Cuba has this show that's aired 5 nights a week called La Mesa Redonda, the round table. And it's specialists that go in, they talk about what's fucked up in the country, what they've tried to do about it, and they assess what it is that what they've tried, how has it ended up, right? There's no one that's more self-critical than socialist projects. And we love to just project this lack of self-criticism on them, and it's bullshit. That's why if I want to read a critique of Soviet economics, of Chinese economics, it's kind of foolish for me to go to someone in the West who doesn't speak that language, who hasn't engaged with that material, and who 95% of their sources are just imperialist propaganda, and who often, like, you know, the Frankfurt School, and I'm sorry, Professor Q, I know this is your field, I feel bad about this, but often is funded by big foundations and by the State Department, right? Why do when I can go to see what they're critiquing about their own existing process, their own project of creating socialism, their own experiment?
So I'm less familiar with the current funding, and all I know really about the Frankfurt School's history, though you can see I've got a book back there on my reading list to go into. Again, this is just what I know. They had a hard time getting funding and kind of had to go, I don't want to say begging, but initially at least begging for funding when they got here to the United States. But again, seems like you know way more about that side of the Frankfurt School than I do, which again tells me I need to fucking read more.
I wanted to ask, because we just did the interview with Gabriel Rocco. He published a great piece in the Salon. I can email it over to you after, but I wanted to ask because I heard a response from a Frankfurt School scholar on Facebook, a quite prominent Marcuse scholar, who said, who cares if we were funded by the CIA and by these big foundations? We accepted the funding because we were both against the capitalism here, but also against Stalinism, and against the evils that they conflate with the socialist camp. So, like, is there, as someone who's in the field of Frankfurt School critical theory, like, how would you approach the question of what Gabriel Rocco has done, the political economy of the ideas and how these ideas have surfaced? What would be like a defense?
Well, I can tell you that comment that he made. I mean, he sounds like and again, he's not, because my advisor isn't on Facebook, or never will be probably if he has anything to say about it. But that sounds like something that he would have said in his critical theory seminar. Thinking back on it, was like they were kind of shameless. But again, he was a student then in the 1960s with the Students for Democratic Society and helped translate some of Marx. But they were all about like, you know, yeah, give us the fucking money and we'll just do whatever the hell we want to. I mean, he's a guy who, like, he got funding from a prominent organization and basically used it to have a party for all of his friends with, you know, in grad school, who were all kind of lefties. You know, I think the joke he makes is he spent it all on weed, but, you know, does where you're funding have an impact on how your ideas are shaped? Yeah. I mean, let's be real. Like, you know, and again, I think it depends too, because they're like, again, I can see some of these old 60s guys being less susceptible to that because they weren't careerists. A lot of people these days are careerists, and they would want to appease their funding masters because they hope to get more from them down the line. And yeah, I mean, you know, again, I'm one of these people who I just extract the knowledge, and like, if it's something I can use from it, great. If I can't, then, you know, I'll save it for later till I can.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Q, that's literally, I think, just emblematic of how a lot of what we do in academia is just a social activity. I mean, that's, again, what led us to form this panel in the first place, was the apoliticization of what we do, and the fact that, like, these days what you see very commonly are people who are constrained by what their financiers want them to do just before they even do it, and then the outputs of that either ideologically align with the financier or are simply just a set of findings that allow them to continue receiving money from their financier, or both. It just speaks to how the institution that we work in, I think it's just become more corrupted by that over time.
I'm also in a different position. So one of the things I often tell people is, as grad students, you have more power in your life than you ever will, and more time in your life than you ever will. Once you graduate, it goes like, yeah, the machine just sucks the fucking life out of you. But I'm in a weird position because, like, I don't get rewarded necessarily for my publishing. So, like, I'm only recognized for my teaching in my position. So if I decide to do research, it's kind of on me. And now, that said, the university here has been pretty good about helping me. Like, this is the first university I've been at where I haven't had to go begging for like $10. Like, they just, you know, say, oh, you're doing research. Okay, here we have some money in the coffers. Here you go. And they've been really good to me in that way. But everywhere else, I have to beg. And even like my first gig, I remember, like, I was interested in studying like LGBT culture, and there were people in my department who told me flat to my face, like, that's not real research. Like, what you're doing isn't real research. So, and again, that goes back into this broader conversation about like what gets funded and who gets, you know, so it's a mixed bag, let's say.
Yeah, for sure.
So I have kind of like a broader kind of like bigger question, like, and Eddie, it kind of goes with what you were talking about, like learning from the past and stuff. And so I want to bring up like Lenin and his like revolution. And I guess kind of, I'm not a historian, but as I understand it, I mean, it seems like it's kind of like a people's revolution that was usurped and taken over into this kind of authoritarian bent. And from what I can understand, it is that he's kind of like seeing it as this group that kind of had to usher in and kind of take the train car like through and to adopt and to change and make the system what he wanted it to be in the future. And I guess I'm really, that like learning about it has made me more skeptical of like oligarchical power structures that have democratic goals. And I'm very like leery now of people that are like, I just need authoritarianism just for a little bit. You know, I just need a little bit of authoritarianism. I'm going to give it right back, guys. Don't
Just as
worry.
a treat.
And I'm like, why not? Like, I want democracy at work. So then why is it okay to have like authoritarianism in this case? Why not just keep it democratic?
Yeah,
Like, help me.
Yeah, so the you're right. It was a popular revolution in Russia, and they had a semi-feudal country at the time. So there were some Marxists at the time who were arguing, no, we need to wait for capitalism to develop in Russia, so the proletariat can develop. And then once the proletariat is fully developed, then they can have a revolution and take us to socialism. So we need two revolutions. Lenin said, no, in this popular revolution, we need to organize and create an alliance between the semi-developed proletariat and semi-proletariat and the peasantry, the workers in the countryside. And throughout the various stages of the Russian Revolution, which there were multiple, Lenin did rally the popular masses around the proletariat and around the peasantry, the proletariat primarily, and the peasantry secondarily. But they would never have been able to take power if they weren't democratically supported by the masses. So the reason that was such a genius strategy that Lenin had was because the worker peasant alliance and the Bolshevik party ended up being supported by the masses democratically, who were carrying out the popular revolution, and there was fighting and stuff like that. But basically what Lenin said is we don't need to have a bourgeois revolution where we have this popular revolution and then we hand power right back to the capitalists who are just going to do imperialism and continue exploitation. What we need to do is not put the Mensheviks in power, the reformists who wanted to ally with the capitalists, but we need to put the proletariat and the peasantry in power. And that's what was democratically supported by the masses in the revolution, which is why the Bolsheviks were then put in power. And the reason Stalin became the leader of the USSR was because he was democratically elected too. Stalin actually tried to step down multiple times as well, but he was too popular among the Russian masses. And yes, he did have a cult of personality for sure, but it was a cult of personality because of the role he played in the revolution, literally robbing banks to fund the Bolsheviks. And because of the construction that was seen under Stalin and how they defeated the Nazis when every Western analyst or most Western analysts were saying they were going to lose. So, the genius of Lenin and Stalin, I guess, when I study the revolution based on some of the sources we've talked about here and trying to go into the archives and read more of the primary sources outside of just the West, but also reading Western sources, I think the genius of Lenin and Stalin is that they got the democratic masses on their side, and then they set up all these systems of democracy. And actually, right before Stalin died and right before Khrushchev gave his secret speech denouncing Stalin as a dictator, which is at a time when the USSR's bureaucracy started to grow larger and get disconnected from the people. Right before that, Stalin wanted to increase democracy, increase the power of the Soviets in economic decision making. So he thought the party bureaucracy was getting too big, too authoritarian, and he wanted to, make some changes that put more power back in the hands of the people, especially in relation to production and economic decision making. So, I think we got to be careful when talking about the revolution. And picking through some of the narratives, just because there has been so much propaganda said about it. But yeah, that's what I would say about the Russian Revolution.
I'd second all of that. I'm what the kids on the block call a tanky. I don't think that there was like an authoritarian shift with Stalin or anything. I'm not anti-Stalin, and I primarily like that because I like to think of the situation in which the policies that even some of the ones that we perhaps might not think are ideal, the situation in which those were crafted. And we're talking about a country that's being attacked by all the leading imperial powers from all over the place, from Japan, from France, from Germany, from England, from the US. And then you have a literal Nazi invasion that they had to prepare for. So authoritarianism has to reign in those moments. We have in the tradition of Marxism, Leninism, a sort of dialectical understanding of the relationship of democracy to dictatorship. In capitalism, we see that there's a dictatorship of capital and democracy for the capitalists. Under socialism, another way of speaking about socialism itself is as the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's when the working class or the peasant alliances or the masses in general have a dictatorship over the power, and they can use that state power to suppress reactionary forces both from within and from without. And so that shift that is somewhat made with Stalin, I mean, it leads to one of the, now it's in second place thanks to China, but it was the fastest raising of living standards just ever. You know, people love to point at the famines, but the famines were virtually just eliminated after that when they were something that was quite frequent. There was 3 or 4 every decade in that region. They were eliminated because of the industrialization efforts. And of course, there's mistakes. The Chinese Communist Party has an assessment of Stalin that I personally agree with, which is 70% good, 30% bad. As someone who likes Marx's ecology, I think that some of the stuff that went on was too good. But the lens through which this sort of the Stalin era is looked at is both the most propagandized era ever, and it's also the one that that usually from commentators has least contextualization, right? And that's not to justify some of the things that were done that I think were mistakes, but if you look at them in the larger context of the pressures that the Soviet Union was under, you can begin to make sense of them a little better and not just think of it as this crazy bad man who is doing all these bad things.
All right, let me check in. Professor Q, I think you've asked a fair amount of questions. Amber, are you satisfied? Like, do you have
I'm
any,
sorry, what?
Do you have any more questions for our guests?
No.
I think we've kind of brushed along everything tonight, you know?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, we've hit a wide variety of notes, and at least something in particular that I'm going to be following up on post-stream is sort of that initial relationship between Marx, Engels, and contemporary scientists, with Darwin as an example. Because to me that stuck out as like the most interesting sort of thread to start pulling and learn more myself, because I don't have too much of that like historical background. Greg, I know you asked a bunch of questions. Graham, are you good?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Alrighty.
Yeah, those are really cool though. The Marx's ecology angle. I never heard of that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think with that we should probably have our usual like post-guest discussion that we do. So I guess we can have Eddie and Carlos go ahead and I guess one more time. First of all, thank you for being here. But shout out what you're doing, because we don't want to take up any more of your time. We just hit the 2.5 hour mark, so we got to cut it somewhere.
Well, that was fun. Thank you all for having us. I hope we can collaborate further too, if especially if you guys are interested in Marx's ecology or Marx's relationship with the hard sciences. I don't know. There's probably a lot of stuff we could work together on there. But yeah, follow us at Midwestern Marx on everything. I do pretty frequent YouTube and TikTok videos, and we're working on our journal. Oh, and we just started a Discord server, or made that public. So we want to interact more with our audience and talk to people and educate people and help people get into organizations so they can do some real work. So yeah, find that on our link tree, our Midwestern Marx link tree. Yeah, you can just Google it, I guess.
I will post it in chat once I find it.
Thank you.
Awesome. And Professor Q.
Thanks for having us on. It was really
sorry.
Thanks for having us on. It was really fun. And if you're interested more in exploring the both Marx's ecology, but the relationship of Marxism to the sciences, I would really recommend Helena Sheehan's work. Helena, that's pretty easily spelled, but Sheehan is Sheehan. But she has a book, Marxism and the Philosophy of Science, that's from '85. That's stellar. And then she has another one something about the zeitgeist. That's about her process writing that book, and that one's also really good. She just recently published a review about her own book, or the process of crafting it, in Monthly Review. So I checked that out. That's how I found out about her work, bought the book, read it. So yeah, there's a long history of the connection of the harder sciences, or the sciences in general, to Marxism. And again, it's often understated here in the West.
Awesome. And what I was just going to say briefly was, Professor Q, thank you for putting this together, because the scheduling work behind the scenes is always labor that I think is underappreciated. So thank you for connecting us, and we'll see what the future has in store for working together.
Sweet. Thank you.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you
guys.
for being
Have a good
here.
one, guys.